Thank you very much, Dan and Sepide and everybody who's come today to participate in this conversation. I'll try to keep my comments, arguments relatively open and informal. You've read the text, hopefully, so I won't belabor you with verbatim repetitions of what is in there, but maybe just begin by sketching what might be some of the resources that we can draw from, specifically in terms of the material that I passed around for today, specifically from Althusser's writings on abstraction in the 1970s. And here, since I see that he is present with us, for which I'm very glad, I wanted to really thank Michael Goshgarian for the remarkable editorial work on these volumes, without which my commentary would obviously be entirely impossible. And also to direct those of you who haven't already to look at the rest of that issue in Diacritics that tackles those works, including the initiation to philosophy for non-philosophers in particular, which I think, Dan and Sepide, you had added as a sort of third text, if I'm not mistaken, the Althusser book in the list of the... Yes. Yeah, just checking. So I suppose there's a few comments in terms of vaulting the arguments that we articulated last time and looking more closely at the sort of problematization and at the categorical and conceptual innovations that Althusser advances in these texts. Obviously, one of the starting points of the debate on real abstraction, as I tried to sketch it out in the last session and the text related to that, was a suggestion, a provocation perhaps, or critical argument by Zizek and the Sublime Object of Ideology, which is one of the more recent or sources in the English language for a discussion of Zonretel and the question of real abstraction, where, of course, Althusser pitted his particular hybridization, let's say, of Zonretel's account of real abstraction with a Freudo-Lacanian account of the unconscious against, right, what he presented as an excessively epistemological treatment of abstraction, you could argue, in the whole theory of generalities in Althusser's For Marx, or at least in that specific text of Althusser, which, aside from some texts of Negri and Paulo Villano, was one of the first places I myself, like some time ago, I mean, 20 years ago, when I read that book, first encountered Zonretel's work. That, interestingly, is the juxtaposition. So there's part of the interest for me in reconstructing a different lineage, a different problematization of abstraction in the corpus of Althusser's writings, was also about complicating, right, that initial juxtaposition of Althusser and Zonretel in that text by Zizek. That's not necessarily the primary reason, I think, for looking at these texts. And as you'll have seen from the Detour of Abstraction piece, I do try to identify or indicate at various moments where actually the problems as set by Althusser, and on the one hand as set by Zonretel, but you could also say as set by various strands of thinking broadly related to the Frankfurt School, not least Adorno himself, or we could even go back to the influence of Lukas's History and Class Consciousness, are very distinct ways of problematizing abstraction, ones that I'm not in any way suggesting are prima facie or even in the final analysis compatible. One of the things that obviously, and it's evident from the heading of this session, that I did want to underscore and that I wanted to explore with you was the extent to which Althusser's work is particularly vital, particularly important for underscoring, I would say, two levels, two strata of abstraction that are perhaps insufficiently articulated in other contiguous discussions of real abstraction, broadly speaking. And so the most pressing one, as far as I'm concerned, and which I try to flesh out in both articles, is this question of juridical abstraction, right? This question of juridical ideology, and in many ways what I'd be interested in really developing in discussion with you once I finish my my kind of preliminary remarks, because I'd like to keep this more as a seminar than as a lecture, so to speak. What I'd really like to tease out, to anatomize in some sense or another, is this particular formulation that Althusser establishes in the text Être, marxiste, en philosophie, regarding the relationship between philosophy and the juridical, right? And this relationship between the determinant role of the juridical and the dominant role of philosophy, because I think this is both complex and also a very generative or productive distinction that he lays out. So I wanted to maybe just to set some of the terms for the discussion, to read out this quote, which is on page 82 of my Diacritics article. Because I do think that this is, this is an element of the discussion of abstraction, the particular articulation of law and philosophy, which I think is intensely significant. And Althusser says, in the secular work of the Constitution and thus unification of the dominant bourgeois ideology, and this was before the translation of this came out, so you'll forgive me, this is my own. It is juridical ideology that was determinant and philosophy which was dominant. At least since the first 50 years of the 19th century, juridical ideology furnished the master ideas indispensable to the constitutions of liberal bourgeois ideology, and it was around them that the work of unification took place. Philosophy was then able to play its proper role by theoretically elaborating questions and answers, which is to say theses and categories that on the one hand could be the expression of this juridical ideology, and on the other could work on the ideas of existing ideologies to transform them in the direction of their unification. So I suppose two things that I wanted to particularly draw your attention to. One, one is this specific image of the work of philosophy, the ideological work of philosophy that is traced in different ways across these writings of the 70s, these kind of courses or treatises that Althusser produces, specifically the initiation text and the Being Marxist in Philosophy, that has to do with the particular function of philosophy as an over-unification or sort of redoubling of the ideological work done by regional, what he calls at some point kind of regional ideologies. And the specific way in which this unifying function of philosophy is both absolutely critical to the work of ideological reproduction, but in some sense also sterile, right? Philosophy produces nothing. Philosophy in some sense does nothing, but its specific way of doing nothing is crucial. And so I think that, and then further to that, the way in which, and I think this is again very significant, the way in which Althusser defines the specific conceptual forms or categories generated by juridical ideology, above all those that orbit around the question of personhood, but also the relationship between personhood and property as ultimately determining the shape that these philosophical categories of unification themselves take. What is interesting there, I think, and again, for me, it's a really significant problem for theories of abstraction that try to work with within a Marxian frame or within a broadly, if open, Marxian categorical apparatus, is to think then this dimension or the stratum of the abstraction specific to juridical ideology in relationship to another dimension, which is, of course, the abstractions specific to science, right? And those, in some sense, in different texts of Althusser, are crucial features. So, for instance, you know, if one thinks of the ways in which abstraction plays in these texts, on the one hand, in terms of that problem that we touched upon last time, namely the problem of the conditions of possibility for the emergence of philosophy, right? Not just philosophical abstraction, but philosophy tout court in ancient Greece. It's very striking at that level that it is scientific mathematical abstraction that Althusser regards as of primary significance, right? Not money and not politics, right? Not democracy, let's say, not figures of equality or what have you. So in that sense, very distinct from that position that one can draw from Zonrétol, which retrojects the commodity form onto the Greek scene, right? To present that as the sort of germ cell of philosophical abstraction. And in that sense, it's also striking because for Zonrétol, the question of scientific abstraction instead is one that really develops much its centrality to his arguments, you know, considerably later, certainly within the scope of the book, Intellectual and Manual Labor. Linked to this question of the origin of philosophy, and for me, this was particularly striking in terms of thinking of the rifts and difference, as I noted, I think maybe in a footnote, between Althusser's argument regarding the place, the ideological place of philosophy in this history of abstraction. Really striking is, of course, the question of the relationship between philosophy and mathematics, right? If we compare it, for instance, to the positions that for a number of years have been advanced by a former collaborator, not quite student of Althusser, namely Alain Badiou. So here in these texts, you have philosophy very explicitly being seen as a way of domesticating, taming the disruptive, revolutionary, you could argue, effects of the introduction of scientific abstraction or of mathematics, right? So that the famous, you know, let no geometer enter here motto over the entrance of the academy is by Althusser interpreted as something like know your enemy, right? It's in some sense, philosophy inoculates itself with mathematics in order to engage in this work of domination and redoubling of the regional ideologies, which we can also, in terms of very striking metaphors, also link to an argument to a simile that Althusser later makes about the ways in which idealism incorporates itself, inoculates itself. Maybe it's just because I got vaccinated yesterday, I just keep thinking about inoculation, but in any case, incorporates within itself an element of materialism, right? And he has this really, I think, jarring and fascinating passage where he says, he makes this comparison, if I can find it, between idealism's relationship to materialism and the colonial administration's relationship, right, to its local or native comprador class, saying something along the lines of basically, you know, if you want, you know, just like the British in their colonial setting, so the idealist needs to have a kind of comprador materialism, right? Needs to have to incorporate its own kind of governing class. I think, yeah, for some reason I can't find the quote, but it is somewhere around here. Now, okay, so those are at least some of the questions that I wanted to raise at this juncture. So on the one hand, these two key moments, I think, in the argument, right? Like, so the first moment is the moment which again are moments that have to do with particular articulations and conflicts over the nature of abstraction, right? So the inaugural conflict, which makes of philosophy an ideologically conservative reaction against scientific abstraction, against mathematical abstraction in particular, which is the origin of philosophy in this double moment of Thales and Plato, right? And so, and Plato representing this kind of capture or closure of mathematical abstraction, or inoculation, incorporation, mathematical abstraction into philosophical abstraction. And then this crucial second moment in terms of the different ideological role that philosophy exercises within bourgeois capitalist modernity, that has to do with the determinant role of juridical ideologies. Now, we could, of course, open up a whole discussion here vis-a-vis the relationship between abstraction and the law in different traditions within Marxism, of course, right? So one very fruitful area of debate, which links to the moment of Soviet Marxism in the 20s, the moment of Isaac Rubin, who I talked about briefly in the piece that we circulated last week, has to do, of course, with Yevgeny Pashukanis's theory of the legal form, the relationship between the commodity form and the legal form, right? So there is a whole account of the legal dimension of real abstraction as determining social relations under capitalism, specifically around the legal form of property, which is very very significantly developed in that moment, right? In the 1920s, just as Rubin is making those arguments about material categories and social forms around the same time, Pashukanis is establishing his general, sort of theory of Marxism. And then when you get to the late 1970s, of course, especially in the context of debates among British Althusserians and then ex-Althusserians, there's a very rich debate, right, around this question of legal abstraction involving people like Paul Hirst and Barry Hindus and so on and so forth. So there's a whole kind of domain where then, many years after the fact, the place of juridical ideology, but also the place of juridical ideologies linked to the commodity form becomes extremely significant. Now, one of the things that I think is striking and deserving maybe of discussion, and which we touched on last time, is of course the fact that while Althusser is centered in these texts, of course, on the question of bourgeois ideology, of capitalist ideology, of the reproduction of capitalist social relations, the question of the classic question for, let's say, a kind of, German or Soviet German line of debates on real abstraction is really bracketed, which is really the question of the commodity form, right? Both in terms of the question of the origins of philosophy, where Althusser relatively quickly dismisses the centrality of the money form to understanding the singularity of Greek philosophy. And secondly, again, right, in terms of the question of bourgeois ideology, as if, and I think this is quite evident also in the discussion, in the, I think, formidable discussion, right, of Rousseau and of the social contract in the text from the 60s that I drew upon in the second of the essays I circulated. It's also the case that in those texts as well, that it's really the juridical viewed in some sense, not from the side of the economic, right? It's not the relationship between the juridical and the commodity. It's really much more the relationship between the juridical and the political, which is of concern to Althusser in these texts. This is not to say that he scants the dimension of the critique of political economy as such, but that's not his primary avenue for addressing the reality and the forms of abstraction and their ideological role within contemporary society. It's not a theory of the commodity form or of the exchange abstraction, to use Zonrettel's formulation. And I think that's really important, right? And I think it's really worth thinking about those difference or those stresses and strains in these theories. What I think is particularly striking, especially in these in the initiation text and in being a Marxist in philosophy, is that is the way that Althusser is very sensitive, very attentive to the plurality and the non-reducible plurality of registers of abstraction, right? And that, I think, in some sense, for me, that's a very fruitful, at least problematization, or at least a very fruitful starting point, right? One of the great dangers, which is partly evident in Rubin and Pashukanis, partly evident in Zonrettel, etc., is that theories of abstraction that ground themselves in this kind of self form of the commodity tend to proliferate kind of isomorphisms or correlations, but do not necessarily do justice to the temporal lags, to the unevenness between genres of abstraction, right? As though legal abstraction was simply a manifestation of, right, or a projection of. And of course, then there's a risk of a kind of, functionalist temptation, right? Or even though it's not a reduction in the classic sense of reducing intellectual forms to social contents, it is, a reduction to form that has its limits. And I think here the legal, which of course Althusser is very sensitive to throughout, is a very fascinating dimension because, of course, the emergence of the historical emergence of legal abstraction as linked to property forms, but also as linked to forms of certain forms of personhood, is much more of a Roman rather than a Greek invention, right? I mean, the Greek court was an agonistic court that was did not have by any means the forms of codification or abstraction of law that we by now take for granted. And I think Althusser is very sensitive, right, to that. And so that there isn't simply a kind of big bang event of abstraction sometime in ancient Greece where politics, the commodity, and law all kind of magically appear at once. One of the, and at some point I'd like to go back to it, but one of the more fascinating aspects of the Être marxiste en philosophie is this whole discussion that Althusser has of philosophy's role as philosophy's function as guaranteeing, right? So he dwells on this issue of philosophy guaranteeing rights, or indeed guaranteeing privileges, you could say. So this is in the footnote 27, and I wanted to mention it because it makes specific reference to Roman law, right? He says, in the history of juridical and political ideology, the triumph of the theory of knowledge or of epistemology within philosophy is for Althusser to be sought in the history of juridical and political ideology, right? So here there's also a point of articulation between the juridical and the scientific, when the scientific is understood in terms of epistemology, and when epistemology is understood in terms of legitimation and guarantee, right? And so he says, in effect, it is not by chance if the philosophical fortunes of the theory of knowledge coincide with the return, right? Not the original form, of course, but the return of Roman law, droit romain, obviously as projected onto the present and modified accordingly by the birth and development of the capitalist mode of production in Western Europe. So it's also interesting that there is this history of repetitions and iterations, right? It's not Roman law in ancient Rome necessarily, it's a Roman law as it meets, as it encounters the science of, the age of, capitalist manufacture. He continues, he says, we spoke of philosophy's guarantee function. One can only guarantee rights, droit. That is because the guarantee of a state of affairs, état de fait, is a matter of force, which, as Rousseau put it very well, does not make right, ne fait pas droit. And it is always a question in philosophy of a theoretical guarantee, that is, of the guarantee of these very particular facts that are rights, which only a foundation of right and a legal reason, raison de droit, can guarantee. This whole history of the guarantee, this long and painful conceptual history of the guarantee, thus ends up ludicrously in the guarantee of private property. And with it, there also ends in the same way the whole long history of the guarantee of the property over things, the properties of things, the proper of things, and of each and every one, les propres des choses et de chacun. And thus of the subject whose hands were always clean and proper, since there is no bad subject, or if there is, there are always courts of law and insane asylums to welcome and re-educate him, in a kind of nod, obviously, to Foucault's writings from the very same period in Surveiller, Punir, etc. But in any case, I find that moment, and also that kind of short circuit between the legal and the scientific, or the legal and the epistemological, very striking. And I think that we can also link this sensitivity to juridical ideology to the sensitivity of abstraction as a practice, right? Also abstraction as a series, as operating through a series of devices or dispositifs. And it's very striking how Althusser, in terms of his critique, right, of that extremely powerful abstraction that is the notion of the general will and the connected notion of popular sovereignty, Rousseau, anatomizes the form of that key device, which is the contract, as it then relates to the formation of the social contract in Rousseau. And in that piece, I tried, just by way of juxtaposition, to link it to Foucault's own reflections on another device of abstraction, which is not just the court, but interesting enough, the table, right? So he has this very striking discussion in his debates with the Maoists over popular justice about, what happens when the table, this minimal device of abstraction, is introduced. And with the table comes a third party, and comes the transcendence of a legal apparatus that separates the recipient parties or the contenders, and so on and so forth. Which also remind me of a fascinating book by an Italian geographer, Franco Farinelli, Blinding Polyphemus, which is kind of history of abstraction in geography, right? Where he takes the table itself again, right? Like the table or the plane as this device of abstraction that has its own quite complicated history. In terms of Roman, the question of Roman law that's brought up by Althusser was also, and this is, something I haven't followed up, but there's some very interesting remarks on the emergence of personhood within the context of a monetized economy in ancient Rome in the work of that great historian of Roman law, who is Jan Thomas, right? So Jan Thomas has this whole account actually of abstracting devices and the emergence of personhood, not in Greece, right? Yeah. But in the context of ancient Roman law, which I think would be interesting to bring to bear on Althusser. So I just wanted to read a couple of passages because I think they do really intersect interestingly with what Althusser says at different points in these texts. So in a text on the notion of a res, right, the thing, the legal thing and the physical thing, Thomas speaks of the formal dispositif, device, that isolates in each of us, abstracting from what is irreducibly singular in us, a juridical personality in which almost nothing appears of our physical, psychic, and social reality because it is reduced to a single function, our capacity to hold and exercise rights. And Thomas brings this to bear, right, not just on the question of the person, but also the question of the thing, because it's the same process that generates what he calls the juridical constitution of things in general, right? So you have this co-constitution of the less, of the thing, and of the person. And that's what allows them to present in Roman law as Roman law is already having a formalist and abstract idea of the economy. And finally, he says, the history of law partakes of a history of the techniques and instruments through which the putting into abstract form of our societies has taken place, right? So I wanted to read that again. So the history of law partakes of a history of the techniques and instruments through which the putting into abstract form of our societies has taken place. One of the things that I think is an open problem and an open question, which I tried to allude to somewhat in the Detour of Abstraction piece, is then, of course, to what extent is there a history of abstraction, right? To what extent, that's why I sort of mentioned the way in which in Althusser's argument, sometimes the question of abstraction seems to veer to the argument that Marx makes about religion, right? Religion is, in a sense, a thing without history. To do the history of religion, because it's what historicizes history is exogenous to it, right? It's transcendent to it. Has to do with those social has to do with social relations that religion itself is not generating of its own right. But then at other points, you have, still in Althusser's own account, these very conjunctural, even evental accounts of, right, how abstractions are generated. I'm thinking of that schema that he presents in the Sur la Reproduction, which is the schema, linking different events within the political and scientific spheres to the emergence of particular forms of styles of philosophical thought. And that's one of the things that I was puzzling with, right, in this text, that there are both the conjunctural elements in Althusser's account, but also what I kind of call these sort of quasi-anthropological ones, right? When he talks about language, when he talks about practice, kind of in general. And maybe finally, one of the, I think for me, very fruitful, again, I think these are texts that are particularly fruitful, not because of the solutions, but because very much of the problems, right, that they establish. I guess there's maybe two issues that I haven't touched upon yet that I think are really richly developed in these texts. One is Althusser's effort to distinguish between generality, universality, and totalization, which I find very, very striking. Of course, he already used, but I think in a manner which is not congruous with the one of initiation, the question of generality in Paul Marx, right? With the very theory of the concrete object and thought that then is the object of Zizek's criticism, also in Sublime Object. But here there's a way in which he links generality to practices, universality, something that emerges specifically with relationship to science, and then totalization is really to be found in the kind of ideological redoubling or over-unification that philosophy engages with, right? And so strikingly, the critique of abstraction is for Althusser primarily a form of, what's the term that he seems to use quite a few times, of detotalization, right? Of a philosophy that, or of a counter philosophy that assumes its partiality and abandons the ideological work of totalizing. Now, to what extent there is a polemic, either with just more Hegelian Marxian philosophies, or indeed with the place of totalization in something like Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, I'm not entirely certain. But I do think that's that effort to foreground, which I don't think is entirely, necessarily entirely coherent or brought to a close, but that effort to think about practical abstraction, to link it to generality, and then to distinguish between generality and universality, and then universality and totalization, I think is significant. And also the way in which Althusser, again, in elusive and elusive ways, tries to thematize the non-philosophical, right? The others to philosophy, the subjects or the subjects, or those who are subjected to ideology. And at that point, I think he introduces another element, which will then be made of a lot, I think, particularly by Etienne Balibar at different points, which is this idea that if we look at it from a political angle, and this again is a kind of inoculation metaphor, right? That the dominant ideology is always, in some sense, also a capture, a theft, and a manipulation of the ideology of the dominated. And this is where juridical ideology is quite key, right? Rights, personhood, emancipation, all legal concepts, all concepts that are also concepts drawn from the practices of the dominated, but then are juridically captured. And you could say, in some sense, Foucault's kind of extremist debates with the Maoist praises of the September massacres and the like is an effort to think, well, what would it be for the ideology of the dominated to be uncapturable, right? Not to be mediated or parasitized or functionalized by a dominant, a determinant juridical ideology that has its place within the dominant ideological apparatus. And I guess lastly, and this is more, and then this is again a very, very open conundrum, but one of the things that I think is particularly stimulating in Althusser's account of juridical ideology, but specifically actually his account of the juridical form, i.e. the contract that subtends the emergence of Rousseau's conception of popular sovereignty of the people that I try to deal with in that second piece, is the question of time, right? Which I think is a extremely thorny and significant issues as it relates to this whole problem about the reality of abstraction. If you recall, in Zon Ratel's work, of course, one of the foremost determinants of the exchange abstraction, what allowed it to play this paradoxical and historically generative role, you could say, is the fact that it's an abstraction that fully takes place in space and time, in the market, in exchange, etc., but whose form is atemporal and non-spatial, right? So it's a practical act, the monetized exchange of products, but it's an act whose formal conditions of possibility mean the evacuation of time and space. It takes place in time, but it has no time in some sense. And what I think is really striking in Althusser's critical analysis of this political abstraction, right, which is the people as constituted by the sovereign people, as constituted by the social contract, is when he engages in his study, his understanding of these décalages, right, these lags, these gaps, these deferrals that are within the form itself of the contract, as applied by Rousseau to the question of the genesis of political societies. And those paradoxes are temporal, right? They're paradoxes of a contract that takes place in advance of the very subjects who are supposed to be taking place of that contract. It's a contract between an individual and a people, which generates the very people that the individual is supposed to be contracting with, and in some sense might also be seen to generate that very, very individual. And I think that to me is a real, also a kind of challenge, is to think not just the the plurality, the integrated, interlocking, articulated plurality of abstractions, and also in some sense of ideologies at these different levels, right? And not thinking that they all just magically match each other at economic, political, juridical, scientific, etc. But to think that maybe they also have very different temporal determinants, right? That they have intrinsically to or imminent to their forms different temporal determinants. And certainly the place of here you could introduce those dimensions that we talked about briefly last time that, Zonreto leaves and other accounts of real abstraction leave entirely out, right? The temporality of money, the promise, the debt, all of this, intrinsically temporal forms of abstraction that largely determine our social and ideological world are not just about the instantaneous disappearance of time that Zonreto found in the exchange abstraction. And so I think there's very interesting resources, let's say, in some of Althusser's texts, also for thinking the time of abstraction, right? Or at least certainly when he's tackling the question of the contract and of personhood and so on in texts like the Rousseau one. Okay, I will pause and end my my disquisitions here. Should we take a little break or just 5 minutes?
We're 50 minutes past the hour, and Alberto, at this point, I think you can take questions unless you want to keep talking.
No, I'm happy to take questions.
Great. We have a couple of questions in the chat. At this point, I think everybody knows that you are basically free to unmute yourself, turn your camera on, and ask the question live. So if you are comfortable doing that, please do so. And again, it's up to Alberto what questions to take and in which order. So Alberto?
I'm happy for first come, first serve if people want to go that way. So Giovanni?
Yes, thank you, Alberto. Thank you again for this great, interesting talk. So my question is more related a bit about the last time, but of course I have also one about the law, but about the first lecture. I mean, or about this paper that you wrote on Althusser book for non-philosopher. No, it's about the notion of abstraction, because like you underline, let me take just a second my notes on it. You underline that. For Althusser, abstraction is not a separation between different components, different elements of the real, the concrete real, because he thinks this is a kind of empiricist or idealist wrong sort of abstraction, but is productive of reality, no? And especially, so my question is about the status of this reality, because he says that it adds something to nature that isn't in nature, and what it adds, like you underline, like you stressed, is the generality of a relation. So it's the social relation of production. So rephrasing my question is, on one side, he's always trying to make a kind of genealogy of this big sort of dominant abstraction that are essentially linguistic, legal, social, ideological. But on the other side, he says that they are rooted in the materiality, right? So he tries to be in a way also a kind of classical materialist, classical Marxist materialist, not really a new materialist, because so on one side he seems a kind of social constructivist, right? Because he says that the real cannot even exist without the imagination given by ideology. But on the other side, he's constantly trying to root this abstraction on the materiality itself. So I find it a kind of contradictory, and I really cannot get a sense on it. Thank you. If you can help me to overcome these limits that I have. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Giovanni. It's really interesting question and problem that you pose, and with the caveat that while I, for what it's worth, reread my own text, I didn't go back and reread the whole of the initiation text or the other ones to try to puzzle my way through these issues. One of the things that struck me, I suppose, in particular, was Althusser's. So, on the one hand, the notion that there is a productive dimension to science and to knowledge is something that we already encounter, let's say, in for Marx, right? So that whole, the whole theory of generalities, which is, it's very much pitted against the notion of a purely passive contemplative or indeed empiricist understanding of theory. What he tries to do in these or hint at in these texts, and I'm not sure to what extent it succeeds, is that he is trying to articulate or scaffold these higher level abstractions, right? Of law, mathematized science, and indeed philosophy itself, in a notion that all practice, all human practices, irreducibly plural practices, are all productive in some sense of abstractions. And this is a theory of abstraction, not, again, as a kind of the evacuation of qualities, but as the extraction or selection and shaping, right? So he says the formulation that I quoted in my text, which is interesting because it enters into this kind of mereology issue, right? The part whole. He says every specific practice, and it's interesting what he lists, right? Labor, scientific research, medicine, political struggle, right? So he's very evidently trying to foreground the heterogeneity of these practices, which do not abstract in the same way and do not have the same or even supposedly isomorphic products, right? Every specific practice, he lists those practices, abstracts from the rest of reality in order to concentrate on transforming a part of reality. So in some sense, but what's interesting is that he also, and that's kind of, I guess, why I said quasi-anthropological. I mean, not to be too like Balibarian with all these quasis, but nevertheless, quasi-anthropological, because he does implicitly refuse any notion, which would make the whole argument collapse, that there is one praxis, right? There's no, like there are practices that have their determinate specificity, but they're not all expressions of, right? They're not all emanations of one capital P human praxis of transforming the world, or at least so it does not seem to be that way. And then he continues, he says, to abstract is to detach a part of the world, a part of a reality from the rest of it. Abstraction is to begin with this operation and its result. The abstract is opposed to the concrete, as the part detached from the whole is opposed to the whole. So it is a separation, but it is a separation and transformation in an indissociable link, right? And in that sense, it's a practical, it's interesting, right? It's a practical abstraction, which is neither a real abstraction in the Zonretellian sense, right? Happening behind our backs and so on and so forth. Nor is it an abstraction in the cognitive sense of we abstract from all of these qualities to find the one thing, like the substance or the essence or what have you. So I think that's one of the things that struck. It was this idea of that starting from this position of practices, which again I find in a complicated relationship then to what, and I frankly I haven't been able to really synthesize what Althusser is doing with the whole question of language, right? And these, which is another dimension which seems to be more originary, if not, or more, even at a lower level, right, than these practices, or maybe that's not the case. I'm not quite sure what happens with that, but in any case, what's key, I think, to these passages is the notion that practices, that practice is irreducibly plural, and therefore also regimes of abstraction. And so there isn't an origin or a source of abstraction, whether that would be the commodity, human reason, or indeed praxis, right, as a kind of generic trait of the species, or what have you. So that I guess that's what I and in that sense, I think here he's also really trying to be a materialist in a gritty sense, right? Like, yes, trying to think that, like that's like the example of medicine, political struggle. These are not abstractions in the sense that they just generate theories or notions or concepts, right? Like in that sense, you could say, the assembly is an abstraction. Like the abstract, the distinction between two medicines is a form of abstraction. It's not just they're not all so not all abstraction is proto mathematical or proto scientific, or indeed even proto juridical. And that's why then Althusser can, in that combinatory mode that he likes to operate with, especially with the determinant to dominant, think about, right, think about the structure and dominance, so which involves a necessary irreducible heterogeneity of these practices that then at different moments or conjunctures are articulated in a particular way. And it just so happens that we could debate this, right? But it just so happens that for him, when it comes to bourgeois ideology, it's this articulation, right? And where it seems that science itself is subsumed, right, by this relationship between philosophy and the juridical. So much so that when philosophy qua epistemology tries to contain and regulate scientific abstraction, it does through juridical categories, right? Right, legitimacy, property, and so on and so forth. At least in these texts, that seems to be the suggestion.
Thank you a lot. It really helps. One last point about what you just said. I think he still insists always to separate anyway sciences, like you say, not one science, from the superstructure, because you always exclude science from by either the base and both the superstructure. This is interesting because, like you say, scientific results can be used by philosophy and politics in an ideological way, but he's still a realist, I think, because he still thinks that science is the only way to have a theoretical object capable to appropriate a real object. Cioè, you agree with me? So he thinks that science is reflecting the reality, but at the same time there can be done a bad political use of science in a conservative way or ideological way also through philosophy. But there is this tension, because he never says that science can be manipulated by ideology in its own mechanism, in its own apparatus. Don't you think so? I mean, he wants to separate this. He put science as the only way. I think he insists since from reading Capital to the last manuscript, saying science is objective knowledge, is not like ideology, or is not like philosophy. Don't you think so?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, yeah, and again, I haven't worked through these texts since writing that piece, but they do seem to sideline somewhat, right? That issue, partly because their concern is different, right? The concern is in a sense with the political ideological status of philosophy, right? So that makes it difficult for me to tell whether there is a distinct, if implicit, conception of scientific practice and scientific abstraction coursing through these kind of mid-70s texts or not. Like I'm not capable of saying one way or another. I mean, what you say chimes with my understanding of Althusser's other writings, but I think in these, I mean, of course, there is this sense in the praise of Thales, right, or in this vision of Plato as the devious reaction against the disruptive character of geometry, right, of the math theme, that suggests that there is an imminently intrinsically not just objective, not just true, but also in some sense, right, like revolutionary or novelty bearing character of science. And that's why I think it's kind of ironic in some way that just at a somewhat generic level, like contrasting these to some of the more overarching statements made by someone like Badiou about the relationship between mathematics and philosophy. It's like the treatment of mathematics is the same, right? Like the math theme is this kind of pure novelty break that even has supposedly intrinsic effects of upturning ideologies and social and political orders. It's somehow qua non-philosophy on the side of non-philosophers, right? Like there is almost this kind of fantasy, right? The math theme is plebeian by definition, right? But then here, instead of Plato being the one who philosophizes such that this invention receives its like apotheosis in thought or whatever, Plato is the one who captures and tames it, right? Not the one who thinks, his time in that kind of quasi-Hegelian way but he uses, but the one who suppresses those possibilities by making them functional. And so there's always this kind of, and that's why I think there's a striking analogy between the political, the vision that Althusser suggests, whereby dominant ideologies are also the theft of the thoughts, desires, and practices of the dominated, right? Not least freedom. And there's a striking analogy between that and Plato's relationship to mathematics, right? Which is in a sense, which philosophy captures and turns to its own advantage whilst allowing it to continue and even seeming to promote it, right? Even seeming to say this is the most important science. But the way that it does so defangs the disruptive possibilities of science, or in this case, kind of mathematics, in a way analogous to the way that bourgeois freedom kills, popular freedom or plebeian freedom, or however you want to call it.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks.
Could I maybe ask a question, or I don't know if there are other people who went first or how that works?
I believe Fuad was the next in line.
Okay.
So Fuad, you can unmute and please ask the question.
Hi, Alberto. Thank you for thank you for these 4 great papers. Super useful, and I think that's most important. I have a question about this tension and these contradictions you're situating between these 2 lineages, which you seem to also have in your other work, say between spontaneity and insurrectionism on one side and programmatic and strategic transitions on the other side. So here it kind of shows up in a different configuration. And particularly with respect to like this first lineage, that kind of Zizek exchange, the whole thing, there seems to be this basically tendency, and you situate it very well, like, and very carefully, all the way from this kind of concern with technological modes of exchange, and then the ways in which they create these modalities, that can evacuate, contents, which then kind of leads all the way up to someone like Meillassoux, the whole concern with hyper chaos, these radical forms of newness, this entire kind of liberal / kind of fascistic concern that's lurking behind all these things, with the possibilities of renewals and all these things. There's that like kind of the whole basically lineage on one side, and then and also exchange also being a form of kind of a constituent, or shall we say, a consensual form of economy, exchange politics. And then on the other hand, you have kind of the Althusser lineage, and the whole more concern with production and the concern with, and the other kind of thinkers that show up, that brilliant conception from Foucault, the infra power and its relationship to hyper profit, and some of these things, and which focus more on use value and the way in which use value then figures into the political and into securing profit and into basically making financialization in the first place possible by securing it. And which then kind of shows up as a concept of the state, someone like Palansas, the whole thing. So there seems to be this this kind of tension between the two. And my question is, why is it that you're situating them with respect to each other? Like, what are you looking for in this tension, right? What are you trying to bring out? And this is important because it seems to me that a sustained conception of the political, of an abstraction and a reality that's specific to the political is missing from all these four papers, not from the other works, but from these four papers. And which really brings out the question when we talk about the origins of philosophy or political philosophy, because there's an entire lineage that say attributes the origins of political philosophy to the literature on to wisdom literature, to Herodotus and Thucydides, the political strategic basically lineage. And if you kind of recast it in this way, we see actually we could see Ala Badiou, we could see Plato as a revolutionary, because he takes this kind of wisdom literature and turns their abstractions, their strategic abstractions into basically forms of constituting democracy and all these things, and whatever we thinks about democracy, that bracketed. So what is then the status of the abstraction as a political form, and how does this relate to that tension that you're trying to situate in the first place? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fuad. That's a really complex and multi-layered issue. One way of getting at it might actually be through where we identify the place of abstraction in Marx, actually. And it was, aside from Zonreto, one of the first texts where I encountered this formulation of real abstraction was unrelated to Zonreto, was in Lucio Colletti's Introduction to Marx's Early Writings, right? And there, Colletti is actually referring to on the Jewish question and to other texts where the site of abstraction is political. It's not that it's, of course, it's related to the economic, it's related to the couplet of the bourgeois and citizen, but it is primarily oriented towards this critical anatomizing of Hegel's philosophy of right, and then of course this practical critique of the nexus of state and state and religion, actually, right? So and that's another element that I haven't talked about here much. I mean, it was one of the angles for me to think through that whole debate around fanaticism and so on via Marx's critique of religion. So one, I don't know, the evasive and pseudo-sophisticated answer would be to say that, these are, different levels, regimes of abstraction, that are differentially articulated and in ways that are not necessarily predictable in different conjunctures and so on and so forth, which I think to some extent is true. So I don't actually think that, or I'm increasingly of the opinion that while the notion of the notion, or maybe we should even just say the problem of real abstraction, or of the reality of abstractions, is a crucial theoretical and perhaps even political problem in the present. I don't think it can be neatly summarized or even like neatly grounded on one genre, right? And I think that is in some sense the tendency of certain value critical Marxisms, the tendency perhaps of certain understandings of critical theory or the Frankfurt School would be to do that, right? That would be in some sense or another. Everything can be related back, or everything can be seen as a rearticulation or emanation of that self form of abstraction, which is the commodity form or commodity exchange, or, you know, or perhaps abstract labor, but there would be one like kind of, and I don't think that is a fruitful way of thinking about this, partly because of the reasons that I tried to detail in looking at these articles of these pieces by Althusser, where both the historical emergence of different practices and devices and genres of abstraction is not congruent, right? And while as Jan Thomas and others show, the very practice of commodity exchange requires this whole legal forms of legal abstraction, it's neither the case that the commodity is an emanation of legal abstraction, nor vice versa, right? Nor that the legal abstractions themselves can be simply understood through the commodity form, which would of course be with the case of Zonreto would also refute, right? Like Greece, you have, commodity exchange, you have nothing like Roman law, you have nothing like those categories. So I think, and that's why I do think, even though I'm not sure it's a history, I think it tests what one might understand by historical writing or analysis, or indeed even these other categories like genealogy or archaeology. I do think a history of abstraction in that sense is necessary. It's actually not the history of a thing without history, right? Now, I do think that there is, you're very right, that there would be a very different lineage to take. It's a lineage of, for instance, somebody who was in the Althusser sphere, so to speak, took, Emmanuel Terret, namely in the book Politique de la Caverne, where he precisely writes on Thucydides, and also when he writes about Clausewitz, like the sense of, which again relates back to also to Althusser's own writings on Machiavelli, right? Like the sense that, but that political, the form of political thought is very distinct, right? It is very, part of the interest in that form of political thought is that it is not a legal normative form of thought, right? It's not a juridical conception of politics, or at least the juridical is derivative to these, and I think that's the attraction, right? Whether for Terret or for Althusser. And in that sense, there are these points where that genre or that style and that history of thinking comes, either comes at loggerheads with the juridical ideologies that subtend political philosophy. And in that sense, I do think that there is, like, if we think of those examples that you bring, there is a kind of truth, or at least a suggestiveness to Alain Badiou's suggestion, which itself is partly related to his debates with Sylvain Lazarus, etc., that there is, that there is politics as a form of thought, and then there is political philosophy, and the two things actually are not related to one another in any straightforward sense, right? The political philosophy is, to put it really crudely, political philosophy is political thought or political practice as captured by juridical ideology, right? It's the political thought that thinks that you need to include within thinking of politics the notion of legitimacy, guarantee, and even perhaps in some sense rights, right? Like it's like, and there's a sense of a disjunction between these forms. And I don't know to what extent that might be something that we can also have as a hermeneutic lens through which to think through the, galaxy nebula of Althusser's writings around this period, right? Of like thinking, is there a form of, is there a form of thought in and from politics that evades the ideologically determinant character of juridical ideology, and that also in some sense evades the dominant character of philosophy, right? That somehow diagonally or elliptically gets around both, because you could say that Machiavelli is neither a juridical thinker nor is he a philosopher, right? Like you possibly, so you could possibly think like once Althusser has placed the ideological problem as a problem of juridical determination and philosophical dominance, then these varieties of materialist, immanent, antagonistic, conjunctural political thought are neither nor, right? Like they're neither philosophy nor are they juridical, and that's part of the promise or attraction. That's not to say that they're like a totally unto themselves. They're of course entangled with these things. There's inevitably points of contact with questions of legitimation or of conceptuality and so on. But that's, I think, I hadn't thought of it that way before you asked the question, but that seems one possible way of thinking of the relationship between a critique of abstractions. I mean, critique in the full, not Kantian sense, but nevertheless, like the conditions of possibility for abstraction or the varieties of abstraction. And then the question of political thought, right? Or, yeah.
Just to add a qualifier, since these points you brought up, yes, and there seems to be this distinction, or shall we say, non-confluence between political philosophy and politics, or the thought of politics, and it's there, in various forms. Say the Althusser of thinking about Machiavelli or imperialism is very different from the Althusser that's thinking about juridical forms, and the conceptions are different of the political, and also. And then the approach to mode of production becomes different in that sense, in that type of Althusser, because insofar as Marx is concerned, ultimately exchange is a dynamic between agents that have the capacity to produce. And so there's a strategic conception in there within the concept of the mode of production, which then kind of in any form of subjectivist, which I think ultimately Althusser falls into that category, ways of thinking about politics, which requires a certain political strategic conception, you're going to have to basically hierarchize and over-determine these abstractions if you want to use them politically and concretely. So that was just one qualifier that I want to add, and wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting comment, but I'm not sure I can add anything further for now to what you've said, but it's very useful.
Let's move on to Kirill next. Here's a question live, so please.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and thank you, Dan. So the biologists Levins and Levontin talk about reifications that bourgeois science relies on. So, for example, evolutionary theory has a lot of reifications from Malthusian thoughts of that time. So I was partly wondering about crossover between reification and real abstraction, but I think it's also significant in a wider sense. So I was kind of wondering about the local. So you stressed that also Zizek, especially nowadays, is all about kind of the local, seeing truth as local within like specific events. And so like we can contend with that, like Levins and Levontin talk about niche construction. So you can have a system, a dynamic system, and then within this dynamic system, certain things are true of that system. So as kind of partly wondering whether that would work with Althusser, because certainly for Sohn-Riefel, there's no outside of the bourgeois science, whilst we are doing science now. And well, as I read him, we can't kind of get outside of that. And that's obviously a criticism of Sohn-Riefel himself, that kind of criticism applies to him separately. And also, I think it's important because, well, so obviously totally different tradition, but Brandom in his reading of Hegel also has this juridical level and scientific level, and in terms of common law. So if I'm a judge and I make a judgment, I make it such that future judges will judge my judgment positively, and I can get the judgment, I can make better or worse judgments in terms of future judgments, and that's what scientists are doing for Brandom. And through that, there are like that's not reification. So we can do science, so we could do law that is better and worse, so we can like improve law, or we can improve science. And I wonder to what extent the literature that you're speaking to, or in terms of your own thesis, would you also see that kind of ability to make those kind of improvements?
The Brandom you're talking about, the more recent book on Hegel, or?
Yes, Spirit of Trust, yeah.
I think that's I'm not sure it directly responds to your question, but it made me think that, well, one of the things that I've found striking, I suppose, in working for a relatively long time in and around French philosophical debates is the extent to which there is just a very nationally specific conception of the juridical, right? A nationally specific conception of the juridical, which then also is linked to the homonymies of law, capital L, right? That is treated both as a feature of the state, capital S or capital E in French, always capitalized, and also law in the kind of, like in the kind of psychoanalytic sense, right? Within, Lacanian debates and so on and so forth. And it's striking because, you mentioned, not that Hegel himself was particularly great fan of the common law. He says absolutely brutal things about British constitution or absence thereof and the like. But I think it's fascinating to think to what extent we can regionalize, right, or specify that juridical ideology and what consequences it might have for other modalities of abstraction, whether scientific, like in the case you mentioned of Levins and Levantin, or indeed philosophical or political. Because if the referent for law is the common law as it exists in, Anglophone countries and settler colonies and the like, it doesn't, if you read certain texts of French law, they just don't work. It's not that obviously there's plenty of critiques of common law that can be just as forthright, but I think there's a kind of blindness or disregard in a lot of the philosophy to how much this conception of law is actually specific, right, to France's own ideology of its own juridical state apparatus, and how much of that then is incorporated in philosophical thinking itself. So that's just like what your comment made me think of, that it would be impossible within that framework of law, or within that conception of the juridical, to make the kind of argument that Brandom, whether it's a good argument or not, makes, right? And that's where, then it's interesting then if you take a figure like Foucault, right? So Foucault is kind of fascinating, especially around the same time that these texts from Althusser are being written, because certainly in his courses, he is trying to read the emergence of these punitive and legal and juridical forms, and indeed, in some sense, ideology is a term that he still uses in the early 70s, in a parallel reading of what's happening in Britain and France, right? So it's a striking moment, because instead of which he does later, right, then in Discipline and Punish, a lot of these elements. But he's reading E.P. Thompson, and other such kind of texts, and then he's treating the emergence of things that will then be reified, so to speak, in the grand legal apparatus and in the state, as in a sense having a more molecular origin, right? Methodist and Quaker societies, forms of self-policing, very like, not just emanations of the state, right? Which is an intriguing issue. And it's funny because I think Foucault is particularly symptomatic, because on one level he's trying to evade the political juridical ideology specific to that French complex, not least in his kind of anti-Jacobinism, for want of a better word, and his weird forms of anti-statism. But then at other points, he seems very much to be sucked back into, right? Like this, for instance, in his, in the way that he then sympathizes with some of the nouveau philosophes' take on this like absolute opposition between the state and the plebs, and so on and so forth. So I think, yeah, that's a kind of striking, just made me think of that. Yeah, biology. Yeah, this is around the same time, actually, speaking of Foucault, that he's writing about François Jacob in some very peculiar way. So there's, I guess the way to the material to look at with Althusser would be his engagement with Monod, right? The French biologist that he writes about, I think, in the late 60s, around the same time that he's working on the philosophy and the spontaneous philosophy of the sciences. And so there is an engagement with the biological sciences that I haven't looked at in ages, so I'm not going to, make things up, so to speak. But that might be one place to look at. Yeah, I think Levin's and Levantin's work is fascinating, especially the Dialectical Biologist, which is a really great book. But I'm really not, it'd be like I haven't looked at this material in a very long time, but I think there is I wonder to what, in what ways one could reconstruct the intersections of these debates in biology and philosophical debates in the France of the 70s, right? I mean, I remember from when I used to work on these things during my doctorate. I mean, I remember very much the way in which, I mean, I was working at the time on Deleuze and Guattari, and there is a very intense, right, effort to incorporate elements of contemporary embryology and contemporary debates about contemporary, but also 19th century debates, right? Like it's in a very potentially kind of eclectic way. But yeah, I think we might have even published the text of Monod in Historical Materialism, but I'll have a look, because I think it was translated separately from it was at the Time of Philosophy and Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists, but was not published in that volume, if I remember correctly, but I might be wrong.
We have a number of questions in the chat. I basically kind of came up with a list of names, hopefully in a fair sequence, based on the questions we received. So Conrad would be next. If you're there, Conrad, followed by Ralph, and then by Alex.
Okay, so I had a few beer in the park today, so I hope I'm relatively coherent when I ask my question. It's important to get out, But I wanted to, it seems to me that one theme that you've been drawing back to is the limitations of Sohn-Rethel's analytic, with respect to the way that it addresses history, because of this kind of, I think, implicit assumption that you can use the form of value, right, to circumscribe historical relations that long precede capitalism. And, you know, in terms of, I think you were positively appraising Althusser, for example, for his sensitivity. And I think it's true in general with Althusser. There's a tremendous sensitivity to the importance of the category, I guess we could term quite schematically, of use value, right? You know, and sort of the correlation, right, between exchange value and use value in capitalism. And that has a certain resonance with respect to, or great resonance with respect to historical analysis as well. But I just, I wonder, you know, I think probably the risk here is, it seems to me that if we're trying to approach, you know, historical analysis, there are a few different strategies we can apply when it comes to this conundrum. And, you know, one is to sort of ignore it in a sense, which I think, you know, I hesitate to say it's a total ignoral, but I think in a way, if you look at Pistone's gesture, in a sense, it's to say, well, there's a kind of capitalist year zero, right? So even when he talks about abstraction, you know, he starts at Descartes, and he does that for a certain reason, right? Because he doesn't want to draw any relationships, right, between the operationalization of the structure of value and historical metaphysics, right, which is a critique he makes of Sanrethel. So in other words, to just say, well, you know, this is something totally different. Things change with capitalism. This is our periodization, right? Another way would be like Sanrethel, which would be to, you know, perhaps go too far in assuming, right, the primacy of these kind of relations in a pre-capitalist context. And another maybe, which I think you're alluding to, would be to try to ground a kind of material analysis, you know, in terms of the social formation without appealing to the extensively to the analytic of value in that way. But I guess my concern about the third approach is that, I mean, well, I understand that you can't simply make these assumptions about the past, you know, and it's interesting actually, because Sanrethel claims to disavow this debate, but we can see the, you know, he says he doesn't want to discuss these Marxological controversies, but we can see the assumptions that are implicit to his analysis. My concern would be that in a way that you lose when you kind of forego the value analysis in a more totalistic way, that you start to lose you know, the rigor which is really essential to Marx's mature work. And at that point, you're kind of left with, like, you know, a kind of sun-dry, I use your adjective here, I copy your stuff, there you go. You're left with kind of a sun-dry sort of structuralist anthropology or materialist anthropology or something like that, you know, and you're getting, and I think it's important as well because, you know, even if we talk about pre-capitalist relations, there are a lot of very, very, you know, without even having to go to Sanrethel, there are a lot of very, very suggestive remarks in Marx's own work, right? So I think, for example, I think there was a Charnel House, right? They were discussing there's an article that discusses the plausibility of your assertion in On Fanaticism that religion is a real abstraction, right? The author, he concludes that it's simply anachronistic, but you know well, and you bring it up in On Fanaticism, that, you know, when Marx talks about you know, Christianity and monotheism, right, that, you know, there's a tendency, I think, to link that to the development of market relations in a certain way, without elaborating too much at that moment, because I think there are different inclinations which prevail across his work. But I mean, I guess again, I just say finally, I think that you know, when it comes to Althusser, I think there's a bit of a risk too. I mean, you're talking here about how, you know, we don't want to just reprise simply a sort of, like, you know, as Sanrethel does to a certain extent, a kind of Enlightenment narrative of European history, right? And I agree with that. But I think one has to seriously raise the question of, you know, to what extent is it conceivable, you know, if we take the idea seriously that, you know, Hegel's Geist is a kind of mystification of capital, or sort of mystification of the commodity form, to what extent is it the case that to secularize something like Hegel's dialectic means to comprehend it as a sort of retrospective teleology of the commodity form, right? Which, you know, again, even from a retrospective standpoint, would provide us the blueprint, right, for a certain kind of continuity in terms of how we address these things. It's like when Althusser says, when he talks about expressive causality, right? And he says, you know, well, if you look at the value form, which kind of comes from Hegel's dialectic, this is, you know, in some level, sort of a theological reasoning, right? And I would want to turn the tables on that claim. And I would want to say, well, what if, you know, theological, you know, spiritualized reasoning is itself a kind of mystification of latent economic structures, which already exist, you know? So that's the question I would ask you, how you kind of negotiate those contradictions.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a tough question. So on one level, I'm very, I mean, on one level, I'm probably more sympathetic than I might have led on to those, you know, to the kind of arguments they were detailing at the end. I guess is what I'm skeptical about is their scope, right? And I think there is, you know, I mean, maybe just to mention Althusser once again, I mean, I do think that there's I appreciate, or I find important, that notion that he advances very late on in the 70s of a finite Marxism, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's not that I'm hostile towards the notion that the value form has this speculative teleological form, which accident of history we can understand somehow as mapped by Hegel's account of absolute spirit, like behind his back, right? In ways whose determination might be difficult to fully understand. That's not it. It's more the ways in which, in a certain philosophically oriented value form Marxism, then that basically just leads to actually a bad Hegelianism, i.e. a panlogicism, which I just think is an untenable position and is not even Hegel's position, right? So it's curious. It's as if like there's this two-step move whereby Marx is, you know, Marx's account is, and that mode, whether it's done by Enrique Dussel or Chris Arthur, you know, like there's a lot of varieties of this, right? Mm-hmm. Patrick Murray and so on. There's variants, and I find many of them extremely important as suggestive. But then there's a way in which that can, as a second step, instead of saying, okay, well, this gives the logical speculative structure to the analysis of the value form, there's the subreption or the transcendental illusion that you can go from that to explaining anything that you want, right? You know, so this reminds me, it's like, you know, or I mean, it's not the same school of thought, but, you know, I remember, like, you know, articles by Robert Kurtz that were trying to explain, you know, school shootings in the US as, you know, the effects on subjects of, you know, the degradation of the value form or what have you. And then you just go, okay, well, then it becomes a sort of panlogicist thing, because you can just skip all the mediations and you can treat the value form as the ab-original and only device or form of abstraction to which everything else is a priori derivative. That's a thing that the logic that I find not just, you know, both unconvincing and also deeply inimical to Marxian method itself, which I think always was capable of grasping the specificity of other regimes of abstraction, right? You know, that not thinking, like the value form didn't tell you anything about British colonialism in India, or what it told you was so basic that it didn't tell you anything about British colonialism in India. Like in Marx, right? Like I think it gives a frame, but then everything else is still left up for grabs, both analytically and politically and theoretically its own. So it depends what you're trying to get these arguments to do, because the huge, ironically, the risk of the philosophical translation, these philosophical translations of the value form, is basically a step back, you know, it's a step back to basically having this kind of Weltanschauung, right? It's like de facto, you've just created a metaphysics. It just so happens that you say, well, it's not really a metaphysics because it's the impersonal automatisms of capital, but then you're using it in the same way as though it was a metaphysics, right? And in that sense, it's a step back from Hegel. I'm not saying this is the case in things like the writings of Murray, or that's not, but a certain derivative use of these positions, which again is also, not to use a kind of Laruellian term, but to use one, it's a kind of fantasy of philosophical self-sufficiency, right? It's like once you've grasped this, you don't actually need to think anything about how capitalism or politics or anything else actually works, because you always already know that this is the working out of this speculative logic, which you treat as fully material and incarnated in these mechanisms of capital, but then you're still treating as a kind of, just like a kind of philosophical object, right? And I think, while I appreciate, I appreciate the resistance to a kind of eclectic empiricism, right? Oh, there's just histories, there's just, etc. There's just capitalisms, which I think is very problematic. I do think that there are, and I think that's what, to some extent, I think Althusser is also partially gesturing towards in some of these texts. There are also different levels of critical rigor in analyzing the regimes of abstraction specific to the juridical, the scientific, the political, economic, and so on. And I think one shouldn't be too quick to think whether logically or historically to assume that a critical analysis of the value form will tell you very much at all about either the law or politics. Like it might, but it's not an a priori, right? It's not, and I think that is also politically significant when, as we, empirically know, those logics of those abstract logics of capital accumulation are compatible with a fairly ample, if depressingly non-emancipatory, variety of political and juridical and other forms, right? Which have their own kind of, efficacy or determinacy or what have you. I still do think, though, like in terms of the Althusser, maybe this goes back, that one of the, I do find it, I find it both fascinating and perplexing, right? Like how much, even in texts where abstraction is a crucial issue, the question of value and a form understood in that Marxian sense is just not it is not in a straightforward way, or maybe a way that I can only now grasp through Kashian or Sunratellian or Adornian lenses, is not really present, right? In that way. And that's just something I find of worth thinking through. I mean, not through like the easy, like, oh, it's a parallax. We can have both. But I do think it's interesting, and I do wonder, like, right, like, so if you were to, for instance, if you were to try to think, you could think critically of the ways in which juridical ideology is deployed in these texts, in terms of those positions. I mean, whether indeed, even to some extent, even in Lukács himself, but you could say obviously in Petrukanis and others, where the juridical form is not it's not just about the person and property, but it's really about a relationship to the commodity form and its conditions that is different, right, than the one that Althusser is articulating, which is where the juridical, I would say, is in some sense always more on the side of the political, or more on the side of the state, than it is, to put it really crudely, on the juridical on the side of the commodity, or of the, and that might also have to do with those questions that I was referring to vis-a-vis Kirill, right? Like the ways these histories of law and these histories of legal abstraction, these legal cultures then also have philosophical effects as well. Where it's, you know, where Althusser's primary concern really seems to be, you know, not that he doesn't talk about property, you know, that he doesn't mention that, but nevertheless, it seems to be about the link between the juridical and the political, not the juridical and the political economic, right? Not the juridical and the domain of value production as such as it might have been in someone like Pashukanis.
I think independence within immanence is important as well, right? So you don't get to this kind of position which is common amongst value theorists where you're devalorizing proletarian struggle and things like this, which I always find really bizarre, right? Because you should be able to recognize the way that even if these things are emergent, right, you know, within this lineage or within this dialectical process, it doesn't mean that you know, you should you know, practically devalue their application. Right?
Okay. Time is very, very short, so let's. We have two more questions that we want to do today. One is from Ralph, and one from Alex. So Ralph.
Yes, I think I can be reasonably brief. You show in your paper and your talk that Althusser fails to follow through convincingly in his picture of the history of philosophy, science, the juridical. It also seems to me that that in your talk, you don't have a completely coherent discussion of how the juridical, science, and philosophy relate to one another. But there are 3 points of concern. There are about 3 dogmatic assertions by Althusser that you don't challenge, even in your criticism of him. And there's a topic that you yourself don't even bring up. Now, those 3 points of Althusser are: 1, simply the declaration that Plato and ancient philosophy is all about the taming of mathematics. And the second one is Althusser's assertion that the modern conception of philosophy is entirely governed by juridical ideology. And you leave that untouched. And the third thing that you leave untouched is Althusser's assertion that philosophy does not add anything. Now, all 3 of those things have to be discussed in terms of having a comprehensive critique. And also, of course, the juridical enters into this modern period, but it seems to be somewhat disconnected from, you know, science and philosophy in relationship to one another. And the thing that's left out of discussion entirely by Althusser, apparently, is also the history of science itself. Because science as we know it now is quite different than it has developed historically from ancient times, and even through the early modern period of the scientific revolution. In other words, that science in all civilizations, and we should also consider China and India in science as well as philosophy, is that it has always been mixed up with metaphysics and mysticism in one way or another. They were never completely differentiated from what we would now call objective empirical knowledge or somewhat theoretical knowledge with various metaphysical and esoteric conceptions. Mathematics and mysticism and logic and all those things have always been somewhat fused in the pre-modern period. And even in the scientific revolution, it takes quite a bit of time for the strictly what we can now consider scientific to be distinguished from theological and metaphysical arguments. And even in the early period of physics and astronomy, you have these issues mixed in together in physics, but eventually they emerge. Then you have chemistry finally being separated from alchemy, and biology from vitalism and so forth. And so there's also a history there. So if you're going to talk about the relationship between science and philosophy, and the history of science and the history of philosophy, you actually have to look into those things, into the history of science, as well as the history of philosophy, and how these functions become differentiated in the modern period. So just considering those aspects of it, you know, there's so many holes, not only in Althusser's presentation, but even in the criticism of Althusser. in which one could draw to some more coherent conclusions out of this, other than simply quoting Althusser saying, well, now materialists have to shut up and listen to the people. I don't find this enormously convincing solution, although it sounds very sweet. It's not a convincing way to end an argument. And what I would like to really see is attacking these assumptions. You know, philosophy is really defined in Greece by taming mathematics. Early modern philosophy is really defined by the juridical, and philosophy actually added nothing to whatever has existed scientifically or empirically. I don't find any of this convincing at all. And I think a complete critique of Althusser would have to address all of these assumptions, you know, as well as address the history of science in a more serious manner.
Thanks, Ralph. So the answer, the first point, I mean, the first point of answer is that actually the aim was a much more modest and perhaps self-serving one, is that I first wanted to figure out what Althusser was actually saying, which takes, or reconstruct what Althusser was actually saying, first of all, not least because it was just an issue of a journal about Althusser. And so I took my remit to be somewhat more limited, but I do take your points on board. As to the first point, I don't myself find the, as you put it, dogmatic assertion of Plato's purely reactive relationship to mathematics particularly convincing, nor is the, nor is the demarcation between scientific concepts and philosophical categories, or even, like the suggestion that what can demarcate within the very person of and work of Descartes, or indeed of Leibniz, the philosopher, from the scientist, is not something that I necessarily find that persuasive. On the second point, though, I actually do think that Althusser has a much stronger point. He has a much stronger point, as I was trying to suggest in his argument about rights and properties and guarantees and the like, about the ways in which, through philosophy and through philosophers also thinking through what they do as scientists, and the two things are to some extent distinct, though not, in different worlds. I do think Althusser is right that juridical terminology, juridical conceptions, and in some sense juridical ideology pervades a lot of early modern philosophy, and indeed its legacy, down to the very forms of rhetoric and engagement of philosophers to this very day in their philosophy departments, and with their obsessions with justifying yourself and legitimizing, like there is a passion for, not least you can think of it's the Kantian, the tribunal of reason is not just a metaphor, right? These are forms of thought that go very deep. Now, I think one obviously can't necessarily take it too far, and it's not, one has to prove or argue in more individual cases to what extent and with what effect that juridification of thought affects how philosophers think about metaphysical issues or speculative issues and the like. But I do think that there is a very, that's I think what I was also trying to suggest in response to Fuad's question as well, that that is particularly evident also in thinking about politics, right? And so that there are lineages, which Althusser is himself very concerned with trying to reconstruct, of political thought that are not overdetermined or captured or framed by concepts of personhood and property and right that are derivative of and functional to a juridical ideology that I think Althusser is largely right in linking to the history of certain forms of class rule. As I hope I suggested, both in terms of Zonnretto and Althusser, I'm interested in the form of their arguments as they relate to debates within philosophy. I think their contribution to the historical research and arguments that you rightly point to is limited, though, that's why I was kind of mentioning some of Richard Seaford's work. They can stimulate some research, right? But of course, the material that Althusser is working with or not working with in terms of the questions of the origins of Greek philosophy, etc., is very scanty and is treated in a very quick way. So I agree with those poems, but I would want to stress that the problem that he's laid out about the relationship between the juridical determinant and the philosophical dominant in terms of the history of bourgeois ideologies, let's say, still remains significant. Was there a second question, Dan? You said there were two.
I know that Alex wants to ask a question. She expressed her interest a bit earlier. So Alex, you're free to ask a question.
Yes, but maybe the time is too short. I don't know. Maybe I just make a comment and you don't need really to answer.
Sure.
I must admit I didn't attend the last session, so it's only regarding the text that you sent for preparation, the Foucault text.
Yeah.
And I disagree, but maybe I have to make transparent that I'm a more Freudian, Lacanian, Žižekian thinker, so it's possible to disagree. And first of all, I was missing the term subject. It's always individual, so it's the non-divided subject, and then the non-divided, the individual. Kind of the cut goes between one individual and the other, and then the whole mechanism of groups and general will in this sense kind of develops. But for me, I work with precarious groups, with different precarious group, migrant self-organization, prisoners, or well, all kind of groups. And what kind of I find problematic, or which I always reflect in 21st centuries, how this doesn't work anymore in this kind of rasters, because when you see how a migrant tries to navigate in the social edifice, it is as a juridical subject, kind of claiming a right is not like when you see asylum law, it's all juridical. And when a refugee tries to get an asylum status, he's absolutely a juridical individual. And he's kind of in a paradox with himself, because in an abstract level, of course, he's against state apparatus and so on. But when it's about his individual status, immediately he kind of addresses the state. The same goes for women with hashtag #MeToo and so on. The problem was victimization, that you always go back into the victim status because you want something from the state. You have to say, I have a problem, dear state, help me. And then later you complain that the state is kind of a big other. So the paradox is the cut that goes between subject of enunciation and subject of enunciated, maybe, but also between this rebel and working class, which kind of doesn't work so clear anymore. I think it was a bit indirectly in your text, but not so explicitly. And maybe as a last example, I mean, what are prisoners? A lot, like, the problem is immediately when an individual has a problem, let's say someone slaps me on the street, I call the police. But then I write a text like, please help me and please give me justice. So the criminals who do not care for the state are always or often part of mafia structures. For example, human trafficking needs illegality as part of the legal system. So I was missing this kind of dialectic and the mess in which we are, that we cannot anymore practically see this different interests of these two, like working class and rabble, but that this is kind of in each subject a big mess. And your text ended with Foucault's take on illegality. So I just would like to ask, maybe you can say something on this mess, and I'm sure you are aware of it. So yeah.
It is indeed, you know, thanks a lot. No, that's very useful, but I mean, I don't know to what extent I have much of an answer. I was struck in, so the aim of the paper was really much, there's a lot to be theorized in both these texts and both these authors. It was really more that I was struck by maybe a somewhat precarious analogy, which had to do with the ways in which, for both in these specific texts, the condition for the emergence of a people as a political name and a container for collectivity and even for subjectivity to some extent, was founded on a kind of disavowal or interdiction of the group, right? And that's why, you know, I kind of tried to provoke a little by saying that, you know, all populisms are individualisms, which I do think is actually the case, but that's a different and more maybe complicated discussion. And I was struck by the ways in which, I mean, I guess in the splitting in the Rousseau is a kind of temporal splitting, right? It's the décalage, whereby it's not so much, you could see it as a split between the subject, but it's the fact that temporally you can't really localize, even though the contract is what holds together the individual in the community. It requires removing the group, but then also this kind of sleight of hand, right? Where you act as though either the individual is contracting with himself or the community is contracting with itself. In both cases, the group is gone, but the temporality is weirdly, you know, it's a kind of ideological temporality of the futur antérieur, right? It will have been the case. And that's why then the corollary of this is that even if you didn't yourself, you have always already signed the contract, right? You're always bound by a decision, your decision, even if you didn't make that decision in some sense, right? Like, so there's that kind of structure. And then more specifically, I was struck by the rabble people thing, I think is obviously very crucial to Foucault. And what's interesting in that text for me was a tension between between what he perceived as the gauche prolétarienne or the Maoists' desire to use the full negativity of the plebs, but in order to make them into the people, and the ways in which that, as mediated by the court, right, even if it is the popular court, for him necessarily then, which you can say is like a sad aspect of the history of actually existing socialisms of all sorts, depends on the division with the lumpen, right? Like the lumpen, or, you know, becomes the crucial to the self-constitution of the kind of people. Now, there isn't, I think it'd be interesting to think, because Foucault is treating this as a kind of strategic political issue. He's not treating it as something that has to do with a theory of the subject, right? Or of, I mean, you could say maybe more in the Althusser text and Rousseau, one could reconstruct that. So yeah, I think that to what extent the political or sociological split then finds an internal split, right? Which I guess is the split that plays out in, you know, all of these notions like dignity, respectability, you know, all of these ways in which you could say are on the fringes of juridical ideology, right? The ways in which subjects can show that they've somehow controlled the lumpen or the plebs within themselves. I guess the other issue is, like, it might also be to think, are there moments that take place in relationship to juridical ideology? I'm thinking a bit like, like Badiou's formulation, like at a distance from the state, right? It's not like just an anti-state politics, but things that take into consideration that in relationship to the juridical ideology, but not necessarily in terms that are fully captured by it. So I was thinking, for instance, I mean, this might be the wrong example, right? But I was thinking of, was a couple of years ago, maybe more, the organization of that strike of undocumented migrants in the States was like the Day Without Us or whatever, which is in itself like as a political form or political gesture, complicated in that regard, because it's not just a straightforward, like, give us rights and we'll be good, right? It's a bit more undecided as a form, like our non-legal presence is a condition of possibility of everything around you. So we're going to subtract labor, which is in some sense invisible, but is everywhere, and see what the consequences of that might be. I don't know if that's like it's not that it takes place outside of, right? It's always in reference to, because it's a reference to the being undocumented. And I guess this was, it's also, I guess, the very concrete political and theoretical and practical problems that people have had in these all of these kind of sans-papiers and undocumented migrant struggles. Also because often, often the radical theorists, intellectuals, activists find out that the people they're organizing with want something else, which is a lot more like rights, right? Like it's a lot more like security, or it's a lot more like housing than like
they want papers.
Yeah,
they want the papers.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the funny thing that kind of Zizek makes that kind of the migrants, they want to become just workers. So it's a privileged position to be the proletariat in a sense. And this is the big gap that that kind of, we think now we get with the migrants, we get kind of a radical mass, but it's exactly the opposite, that the migrants want to become just a normal abused worker in a legal system.
Yeah, I don't think it's exactly. I mean, I think it's a useful kind of critique. I don't think it's necessarily like historically the case that those are always conservative formations, right? They can be, and definitely that's a very important tendency. But that, yeah, I think then it's a much more conjunctural issue whether it takes that form, which is then of course a form that then the state finds quite comfortable to deal with, right? Because the state engages in its paternalistic amnesties, interesting legal term, gives a citizenship, and then treats this mass as being somehow a now protected, secure mass of people who will be loyal to the state, and so on. Yeah, but in any case, it's a very interesting set of questions to think through.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, so indeed we got very good questions today. Thank you so much to all of you. I think we're a few minutes past the hour, so let's wrap it up by thanking you, Alberto, for joining us on this study group. That was very good, very informative and illuminating. Again, thank you for all the participants for the very good questions. And of course, thank you, Sepide, and for the objects for hosting this session today. Now, we do these sessions all the time. So if you follow us on social media, that's where we post announcements. And in the past, we had very good panels, and then more coming up in the future. So we hope that you can join us in the upcoming sessions. And with this, I think it's a wrap.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dan, Sepide, and everybody for your questions and comments and so on. It's been really, really interesting and really useful. So cheers.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for joining us. Thanks, everyone.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
See you guys.